welcome to 12 Rules for What. Welcome back. We're thrilled to be here with Spencer Sunshine, who everyone should know has written a great book called 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, which is excellent and does lives up to the title. Lots of books, they give you a title. There are definitely 40 ways in that book to fight fascists. But let's start a bit more kind of personal. Let's start a bit more kind of biographical. Just tell us, Spencer, what is your kind of personal history with anti-fascism? You've been involved with it for a really long time. Just tell us some key highlights, I guess, of that personal history.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different background than a lot of people, although there are other people like me. I got involved in the punk scene. I lived in a small town in the United States in Georgia in the late 80s. At the time, they were very young. It was not common for people to be very young and involved. And it was at the time that the area I grew up was one of the centers of the Nazi skinhead explosion. So I was in high school in 1988, which was the year it really took off in the United States. It was a little later than in Britain. So I ended up going to school with a bunch of Nazi skinheads. And my town had been a town that was a frequent site of Ku Klux Klan rallies. And Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler, had actually been shot there. He's in a wheelchair because he had been shot by a neo-Nazi sniper in that town. And so I became in conflict with them. The Nazis were sort of running the punk scene at the time. You'd go to shows and there'd be 1,000 people because it was before Nirvana and all this stuff became commercialized and popular. There'd be 1,000 people at the show and there'd be 50 roided up skinheads intimidating everybody. So I quickly got into conflict with them. My family's, partly Jewish. I had a black girlfriend. This didn't, bode well for social relations. I ended up meeting up with some adults who were running an anti-Klan, anti-Nazi monitoring group. They also did legal grassroots counter-organizing. They had mostly from pretty radical left backgrounds. An ex-Zippy, anarcho-syndicalist, an Irish nationalist, and an ex-Marxist-Leninist party member. And through them, they introduced me to some other people who come out of the punk scene who are teenagers and had contacted them. And we formed essentially an anti-Nazi group inside the punk scene. I think I was 16 then, to do we mostly did counter propaganda, but we were the only group in this large punk scene to be speaking out against, the dominance of, neo-Nazis, the political dominance of neo-Nazis. It wasn't a terribly political scene, but the Nazis were the only organized faction. And I got into radical politics through that and came back to it in the mid-O's through two things. One was we were running into people in the kind of mid-period anti-globalization scene who are getting more and more into anti-Semitism, as part of their Palestine solidarity stuff. And as we objected to it, they would dig down on it. And we were like, this is not right. What you're saying and doing is not right. And the other was that we started finding fascists who were cross-recruiting, the national anarchists who started in Britain by an ideologue named Troy Southgate, who was a veteran of the National Front in the 70s. And as they went through splits, he went through these splits with them and popped out with his own ideology, which was a sort of decentralized crypto-fascism that then was trying to cross-recruit from anarchists and radical ecologists and others. And they had a little bit of success. This had been dealt with sort of in Britain in 2000, 2001, but was popping back, had migrated to the US and Australia and was popping up and became an issue here. So through those two things, I got back into looking at the far right. I'd had this sort of background. And then when I finished school in 2013, I was asked to be a fellow at a think tank that did this work called Political Research Associates. And so I quit my job in mid-2015 to write a study of militias in Oregon, which was very prescient because about 6 months later, there was an armed takeover by militias of this wildlife refuge by the Bundy family in January 2016. And so I was sort of already off and running by the time Trump came to power. The militia stuff was actually what we saw there, and what we saw with the weird crypto-fascist stuff and the cross-recruiting was this rise of the far right. We were just seeing its impacts in different, now I'd say, this was almost a global, especially in the US, but part of a global rise in how large the far right was, and it was starting to impact different areas, right? Impact the ones who are cross-recruiting and impact the militias and stuff, but it was all part of one thing. And so then, I was sort of front and center when the Trump was elected. I literally had flown that day. I'd flown back from Germany. I'd done a speaking tour about the U.S. right, and I was flying back the day of the election. I was like, oh, Trump will lose, and we'll see what all these people do. But I was like, okay, well, and the last 4 years have been one, long marathon.
That's really great. What's kind of interesting about all those different forms of engagement with anti-fascism that you mentioned is they always seem to take place. I mean, maybe not always. They often seem to take place in the context of some other cultural space, right? So they take place in the context of the punk scene. You mentioned the national fascist. Oh, sorry, the
national anarchist.
What's it called? National anarchist. Sorry, the national anarchist kind of. There's a great blog called "Who's Who in the National Anarchist Zoo," which I can't verify the information on, but I think it's a great title for a blog. And so they mentioned there's a kind of a cross pollination there with like radical ecology and sort of, I guess, what people might describe now as kind of eco-fascist ideas. And then there's, of course, like the militia movement is in some ways like a different kind of cultural space, right? It's a contested space about like what is the American West in particular, and these kind of like things like this. So I'm wondering, like, do you think it was important for sustaining a kind of anti-fascism through that it was always attached to some other thing that you were trying to defend? Because I'm thinking about this now, because it seems like there are lots of people who have become or decided to use the identity of being an anti-fascist kind of on its own, like a neat anti-fascism without some sort of mixer. So I think that seems like a fundamentally different kind of political movement to say that we are defending punk against fascism, or we are defending our particular community against fascism, or we are defending this, to say that we are against fascism and that is the limit of our politics. It always seems like it somehow doesn't have the same richness to it. But I mean, maybe, I don't know, is that something you've kind of noticed in your own like history?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the punk and the communities the same way, but for sure, especially in the old days, there was a lot of, and this is sort of faded, fight over milieus being contested terrain, and the fights over that, where people were participants in them. So people who were in the punk scene or who were skinheads, and you see this now in some niche things like in heathenry and other places, and to some extent radical ecology, where people are fighting within their own politics or their own milieu for control over it or against, cross recruiting. The militia stuff's a little different because it was happening in rural communities, but it wasn't like the self-selected milieu. It was geographically defined. They acted more like a generic political movement, but, I was working with, I was more just like producing research, but, in close contact with a group called the Rural Organizing Project. And they were for sure trying to mobilize people in these rural areas to push back against the militia recruiting and activism and organizations. So that was like a bigger level contested terrain. Now, what's happened with the anti-fascist movement in the US is it's been, become a popular movement on the left. It's much different than it was in the 80s and 90s, because then it was really still pretty niche to the counterculture stuff. I remember, I think in 2018, the first time I met someone who was just like, I'm an anti-fascist, like they had encountered it like a preset identity, and they were like, I'm an anti-fascist, so I dress this way and I do these things. And I was just like, well, that's really weird, like, because it had been this very loose and kind of more, I think, more interesting thing, and it wasn't like I'm an anti-fascist, so it means X. We were like, we come from different backgrounds and we're trying to conceptualize, because there was a lot of strange stuff going on. Like we were running to Latino neo-Nazi skinheads here in New York. It was some of this stuff which presaged these multiracial far right groups like the Proud Boys. And we're trying to understand it. We're trying to figure out what tactics we could use to combat it. So it was weird when it became its own sort of identity or its own like concrete thing on the left. You saw the politics shift significantly, where they just became whatever other politics that were on the left, filling it in with generic left-wing politics, which were sometimes quite to the opposite of the politics we held, and sometimes, if you ask me, don't work well with anti-fascism. Various kinds of racial nationalism, like nationalism, the oppressed racial nationalism, has never fit very well with anti-fascism, but it's so dominant on the left in the United States, at least. It just comes in, people just adopt whatever else is there and sort of ram it in without looking and seeing if that's in contradiction or thinking through what anti-fascism might mean in terms of, I mean, it shouldn't have an other ideology, but what it might mean in the reflection on their own politics. For some of us, it was a reflection on our own politics and what those things meant. So yeah, I agree with you. There's not much sense left that there's fight over contested spaces. I mean, there's fights over platforms, but it's no longer people really recruiting and trying to recruit from a space that you are. It's very much here's the right and here's the left. And yes, sometimes people go over from one to the other, but there's not a fight over control of a smaller, well-defined area, whether it's geographical or cultural.
I kind of wonder how this kind of like Antifa versus like Trump supporters, Antifa versus Proud Boys, this kind of right versus left thing is developed over the Trump presidency. And it seems like Antifa as like a bugbear of the right has like really come into its own in Trump land. I wondered, what's your take on his leaving the presidency? Where do you think this kind of conception of Antifa goes from here? Do you think this is still a useful kind of boogeyman for the Republican Party?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that before. So yeah, the Antifa thing, basically Antifa became the old communists. And in fact, some of the people who created the conspiracy theory did it. It was like communist, Antifa, where communists are this like thing that's, everywhere and everything, and includes liberals and even moderate conservatives. That the head of the John Birch Society, I think in the late 50s, early 60s, said that Eisenhower was a communist. So like everything's a communist who's not on the far right, basically. That idea has, become adopted throughout the United States. Conservatives, including by the now gone president, and many in Congress who are still in Congress. So we'll see how useful that is as a bugbear going forward. It'll certainly continue for a while. Some of this, because it's been so disattached from the actual Antifa movement itself, it could continue on. I mean, they're like Nancy Pelosi's a communist and Joe Biden's a communist. So they could, Antifa. So they could keep this on totally disattached. So there's like some string of relationship to reality still, right? There is an Antifa movement. There are clashes on the street. So it could become totally disattached from it and continue. Some of this I think will really be contingent on whether there continues to be a militant street far right movement, whether the Trumpists, I called them at the beginning of the thing independent Trumpists, because they were pretty disattached from the GOP, Proud Boys and other people doing street actions. They kind of got more attached and they're going to become disattached again. So if the independent Trumpists are able to keep up a militant street movement, then the clashes with Antifa will continue, and then the conspiracy theory will continue for sure. But that's going to be predicated on if they're able to do that. They may just become totally disillusioned by Trump leaving. Some of that will depend on if Trump tries to remain a political figure or his children try to take his mantle up. I think Don Jr. is in a good position to do that. Will Trump want to do these, speaking engagements across the U.S. with diminishing crowds? Like, I don't know, maybe his wife's going to be like, enough. you had your thing. You never liked it, clearly, right? Let's just go golf for the next 10 years. So, I mean, I think it depends. It's a good question. I hadn't thought of it, actually. Possibly for a while, yes. The long-term thing is it depends if it really, if the conservatives can keep reworking it in some way, if it keeps intellectual hold on the base, and if the independent Trumpists continue, the clashes will continue, and then it for sure will continue.
So you've had this new edition of this zine come out, 40 Ways to Fight Fascism, and it came out a few months ago. I'm not doing the interview now. It seems to be very much in a trend of like expanding like what counts as anti-fascism beyond what people traditionally think of as anti-fascism. And I wondered how important you think that was. I mean, obviously you've found 40 different ways of making it important, obviously. So you obviously think it's important, but why is it that we need to expand our kind of conception of what anti-fascism is?
There's actually 41, and then I thought of another one, so there really should be 42, but it's 40 and then a bonus round, because 41 Ways to Fight Fascism didn't roll off the tongue so well. So it came out of, the original edition was in 2018, and it came out of a very concrete organizing problem we had here in the United States, is that the anti-fascist movement could not mobilize enough people in the streets, period. Like, I was at Charlottesville, and we didn't have enough people at Charlottesville, and we didn't have enough people because it was only mobilized by local groups in Charlottesville and Antifa groups. And we could see that was the limit of how many people could be pulled to a demonstration, which was like 500 to 1,000, without having more moderate groups, national groups, nonprofits, NGOs, etc., get involved. And what's happened really over the last 4 years is none of those groups have become involved in the grassroots level. People create documentation, and there's these anti-extremist organizations, and there's lawsuits, and I think this is all good stuff, but none of these groups that have a tremendous amount of money and pull and followers have called their base to engage in grassroots work against the far right, whatever you call it. I don't care. If you read the guide, you'll notice that the word anti-fascism or Antifa never occurs in it. I don't care what people call what they're doing. Some of this is that the Antifa thing has just become too associated with violence, and that in itself turns people off who, they're not interested in violent conflicts. And it just creates a negative reaction in a way it shouldn't, but it does. And so I wanted them to think that they can do this work anyway. Most people who do Antifa work don't do the street conflicts anyway. It's not most of the work, and it's not even most of the people. But that ruins the whole idea of it for a certain group of people. So I wanted to make it palatable to people without having to explain what Antifa was or go around and do this dance. So I just wanted more people. We needed more people to get involved in this stuff. We still need more people to get involved in this stuff. People who aren't going to adopt this identity as an Antifa activist, who aren't already part of the radical left, who maybe aren't even interested in these other parts of the radical left. Who are older. Some of this were people who are homebound because of age or disability or health status or families or whatever. So it was part of a real attempt to engage a broader group of people into doing this work, because we really have needed a broader group of people this whole time. The problem with the far-right street activism could have been resolved in 2017 had a broader group of progressives mobilized people to turn out, especially when the movement was smaller. I mean, you weren't getting 500 Proud Boys and militias in tack gear with guns showing up and ready to really rumble in 2017. It wasn't happening. The Heather Heyer who died in Charlottesville was became an iconic thing, because at the time you didn't have one person die at a demonstration. Now people shrug their shoulders if, people get shot, murdered at demonstrations, and people are like, oh yeah, that happened again, right? So this could have been shut down at the very beginning, but there just wasn't the political will outside of the radical left to do it. And so the whole project of the guide is to attempt to get more people involved and mobilize more people. And I kind of think it's interesting. It's happening for the first time in the aftermath of the Capitol takeover, where lots of really liberals are getting involved in open source intelligence gathering and identifying people who went to it and really doxing them. Now, a lot of them are turning them over to the FBI, which isn't my politics, but they're doing the same work that Antifa people have done, and they're doing it willingly, and they're self-motivated to do it. So that's actually a new thing here, and I think a good development.
I wonder how important SEIGE is, particularly in counter demonstrations. You mentioned it a couple of times, because I'm thinking about in the UK context, SEIGE is absolutely essential, right? You need to have like twice as many people against the far right group in the UK, and I guess that's for a couple of reasons. And I guess there are a couple of ways in which it might be different between the UK and the US. First is that we don't have any guns, right? So like there's no force multiplier in the UK. 500 people in a far right organization will lose to 2,000 people in an anti-fascist organization. Like just it will, they will lose, right? Regardless of how kind of individually tough they are, and essentially the only changing factor is how disciplined the anti-fascists are. That's obviously not the case in America, right? Like one person with a gun beats 2,000 people without a gun. So I'm kind of guessing, like, how much do you think that kind of size is really important? And the other thing is it's important in the kind of difference between I think the US and the UK, at least is that at least in the process I've seen from the US kind of footage of, is that in the UK, at least in London, in central London, where most far-right activism takes place, the police as an organization completely dominate the streets. They determine who goes where, at what time. It's very rare, although it does happen occasionally, that anti-fascists or the far right manage to break out of these essentially state-sanctioned cordons. So how much is that like size really the kind of the key factor there, or are there other kind of strategic or tactical factors that determine the success of particularly counter demonstrations in the US context?
Yeah, the things in the U.S. have changed significantly. I mean, from my understanding, like in Britain and Germany and other places, the anti-fascist politics are going the same, and the whole dynamic has gone the same as it's gone for many years. And here they totally switched because of what was new under Trump, that there was a multiracial far-right groups that were behaving in the streets like Nazis, but their politics were significantly more moderate than them. But the people doing anti-fascist work didn't recognize this was a change. So basically, before Trump, stuff rolled out like it does in Europe. There were, I think, I don't know quite how the right-wing populists are dealt with, but here, there would be Nazis or Klansmen. You could have a counter demonstration. There could be a militant core, and you could mobilize a lot of people to come. It wasn't hard if you did some work and outreach to outnumber them 3-1, 4-1, 5-1, 10-1, 20-1, right? You could do this because the enemy were fash. I mean, they were full fash, right? Some would say full fash and half fash, but we used to. So the problem is that the anti-fascists didn't change their strategy, but the context of it changed and the opponent changed. The Trumpists, and this isn't really recognized by a lot of groups, weren't most of these new groups weren't full fash, other than Charlottesville. That was a case of that. These groups are multiracial. They're not calling for a white ethno-state. There's no open anti-Semitism, And the problem is a lot of people on the left use these other sort of left analyses, and they're like, well, this is just white supremacy and I don't care about the details. And I mean, that's fine for your critique, but that doesn't work when you're mobilizing people to your side. If the people aren't full fash, this ability to pull out hundreds and thousands of people doesn't happen, because we've seen it not happen. And so this has made the numbers. This has made basically the only people you can pull out are already radical leftists, with a smattering of other people, like maybe in Portland, where this has truly become anti-fascism has truly become a mass movement there amongst the city. You can pull out some more people, but generally you're only pulling out, hardcore people. And as the far right stuff, I mean, they're basically equivalent to right-wing populists in Europe, And so as their base has expanded and the ability of anti-fascists to pull sympathetic people has declined, most of these clashes have ended up in general with equal numbers. And the second thing is, in the past, the police very aggressively would separate people. Incredibly aggressively. And then as Trump came in, they just stopped. This actually happened beforehand. We saw it in 2016. They just stopped doing it. They would just stand back. For first couple of years, they would just stand back. This is what happened in Charlottesville. They just stood a block away. I mean, they just didn't intervene. And then, like in Portland, where they had to intervene, and there were some cases they didn't intervene at first, they would really favor, they weren't trying to separate everyone and see them both as, extremists they wanted to get rid of. They were clearly favoring the far right. I mean, not all the way, but there would be, they would tend to be harder on the left and tend to be softer on the right. They wouldn't arrest right-wing figures who had warrants out for them. It was just very obvious, someone would wave a gun around and they wouldn't arrest them. So it wasn't like they just, cleared out and gave them full reign, but they were clearly, there was clearly a bias in the policing, a very clear one. And so these two things together, the failure of police to treat both sides equally, and the inability of the anti-fascists to mobilize people because of, in my opinion, their inability to understand that there was a significant difference between full fash and these right-wing, multiracial right-wing populist movements, has created this situation. And again, it was one reason I wrote the guide, is I really was trying to mobilize another layer of people to do something, whatever it was they were doing. And if nothing else, to take the pressure off of militant anti-fascists from doing this work, from doing the research, from doing, support work for prisoners and people hurt, that would give people more bandwidth to do work. That was especially important very early on.
I had a question about looking after ourselves and looking after each other. You said you were at Charlottesville, and I've been in big kind of anti-fascist demonstrations before, and they were very stressful. I imagine if I was in Charlottesville, I would be extremely stressed out, to put it mildly. How can we, and even like the non-demonstration street work, non-street kind of activism, the reading a lot of far-right literature, I find quite anxiety-inducing, just because it's racist and anti-Semitic and horrendously misogynistic or whatever. So I wondered, how do you look after yourself when you're reading this stuff and doing anti-fascism? And how do you think we as anti-fascists can better look after each other as well?
Well, my answer probably isn't going to be very illuminating. When I first started reading it, it was disturbing, but at this point, it's just, I'm immune to it. I'm like, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, now you're saying this. I have read all these things hundreds of times. I'm like, well, that's not a very good, elucidation of that talking point. You're like, oh, you delivered that really well. Yes, the Jews, so that doesn't bother me anymore. I know it. I remember when I started, it did, and I'm sure it does that to other people. And here we don't really, the street clashes on the East Coast have dried up. So it's really a few cities on the West Coast. And, I don't know. It's, I don't know what people are doing out there. It's probably good to have a structured network of how to take care of people if they're physically injured or traumatized, have medical care available, have, people to follow up with them and see whatever their needs are. Because people always have different needs after these things, there can be all kinds of different things. It's not just one thing, and have some structured way to take care of people who are hurt in this work. But I can't really speak to it because it's not really a live issue here so much. It was after Charlottesville where a lot of people were hurt and we couldn't get any, people were losing their jobs and all this money had been collected. And if you know this, like $1 million had been collected by DSA and they refused to release any of it. And then we were like, people were like losing their jobs because they were hurt so bad in Charlottesville and they were getting evicted. It was really crazy. So, but that moment here has passed. So I can't, because we don't have all these injuries and stuff and the big clashes here. Other people on the West Coast would have to speak to that. We're a big country, people in Europe forget it's like the size of Europe, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested about this like East Coast West Coast dynamic. I tried to suggest something to a previous interview we had with Alexandra Mina Stern, who wrote a book called The Proud Boys and the White Ethno State, which was that there's a fundamentally different kind of like fascism that exists in the two parts, right? There's like there's kind of foundational fascism, or like a founder fascism that exists in the East Coast, and there's kind of the manifest destiny fascism that exists in the West Coast. I don't know if that's at all compelling as like a reading of the distinction between these two things, but do you see that there are distinctions between the forms of far right groups that exist on the East and the West Coast of America?
No, I think they're generally the same. The West Coast, because I used to live on the West Coast, is just a lot more open. It's not as populated, and there's something that's gotten in. You just have there's more room for radical movements on both the left and right. Like Oregon, I lived in the 90s, and at the time there was like an anarchist movement with thousands of people. I mean, it was really kind of bizarre. And Oregon especially is... Portland is just not very well policed and not very well controlled. The police are very violent, but it's actually a very small police department. And there's just, the city doesn't control everything. So it creates a space where all kinds of wild things can flourish, and those can be good and bad. Similarly, there's just a similar kind of feeling out West. There's just for whatever reason, a feeling of real openness, and that can go in good ways and bad ways. And, we've seen over and over various kinds of radical, cultural and political movements have emerged from the U.S. West Coast. So the actual ideological things are about the same. I don't think that there's a real difference. There's just there's more space for conflict, and it's just less policed in a way.
You talk about these kind of multiracial groups. I'm guessing that could be a description of the Proud Boys, but it could also, like, in the same way, be a description of things like maybe even some of the kind of the militia movements, or even the Boogaloo Boys, which were, I don't think, I mean, there were definitely some groups inside that were expressly white nationalist. But it seemed in some ways like intellectually unclear or ideologically unclear. But it could also refer to things like QAnon, right? Which is vastly more heterogeneous than any kind of normal white nationalist group or so on. I'm kind of wondering, like, where do you see these things going in the next under the Biden presidency? I guess, like, where do you see these things moving now? Do you think there's going to be hybridization? Are they going to split off into their own kind of little silos? What's going to happen?
Well, I talked about this a bit before. It's really going to depend on what Trump does. It's going to depend on if they're able to find a new sort of issue or tactic to glob onto. I mean, these street confrontations are kind of a new thing for the U.S. far right. Like, it generally wasn't a street movement. That sort of started maybe with the Tea Party, and they had stationary rallies. So even these conflicts have been a new way for them to organize and attract new people. There's like excitement in it. It's something you can just jump into and do. And it's a live issue. And if they don't, and just supporting Trump was a live issue, and they're going to need to find another issue to keep going, or it's going to start to sputter out. I agree there's going to be more factionalization. Trump has been a great unifier for them. This has been definitely one of their absolute strengths, because the far right in the U.S. has always been marked by a lot of sectarian infighting, a lot of squabbling, a lot of grifting, more than the left. And perhaps we just have it structured more in NGOs or something, and they just have figures who are trying to steal from each other, but I don't know. And without that unifying figure, it must fall apart more and more. The Proud Boys are going to sort of splinter. I mean, their movement's also going to splinter as, the conflicts with the police have they become more radical, and the conflicts with the police have increased. This more radical wing of both the Proud Boys and the larger Trumpist movement are going to get and are already in conflict with the more moderate members of the movement. I mean, the more radical people, they're, at the Capitol takeover were, yelling to hang the Vice President Pence. I mean, this is going to, before these movements have been, buoyed by their association with the GOP, with the Republican Party, right? They're the street activists of it. And now, they're coming into conflict with it. So that's going to create more schisms, but that will also bring more people directly into the neo-Nazi movement, or encourage them to work directly with these more radical things. Because a lot of the fascists have abandoned the whole Trump thing. They're just like, oh, Trump's a sellout. He's surrounded by Jews. He's clearly not serious about the racism thing. And they've got his number right. He's not serious. It's just some words to attract his base, and he's fine with demonizing people of color. But he's not like an ideological white nationalist, which many of them had convinced themselves that he was at the very beginning. And, they actually see more clearly than I think the rest of the Trumpists do what's really going on.
For sure, yeah. I mean, like that's I guess I'm kind of wondering about this split within the Proud Boys, how significant it is in the context of a kind of post 2018 split already between people who decide to latch themselves onto Trump and kind of, or even latch themselves onto the Republican Party, right? So Nick Fuentes and so on becomes this kind of like figure who's trying to radicalize Republican politics from within, whereas you get people like Richard Spencer who say that's stupid, I'm going to go off and do a very kind of badly produced podcast instead, which is fair enough. I think that's the tactic he should be pursuing.
Well, Fuentes is, people don't say this, he's doing a classic entryist move. That's just what it is.
For sure. Yeah, totally.
Like when Militant went into the Labor Party and people are confused by it. I'm like, no. And he's rejecting there being an independent white nationalist movement. Spencer is continuing an independent white nationalist movement, but I don't know what his game plan is. He's waiting out this lawsuit, I think, is why he's quiet. I think he's looking at the long term, which probably works for him, but it's not going to work for the movement. And then these other people who believe in an independent movement, they've washed their hands of Trump, and they're hoping to inherit the bulk of the Proud Boys or something, or they're the logical endpoint of the bulk of the Proud Boys. Although some of them will split off because the members are people of color whose girlfriends are people of color. I swear we've seen multiple instances in which people did not go over to white nationalism, and we figured out their wife or baby mom or girlfriend wasn't white, and even when they split up, then they became white nationalists. So whatever's holding some of them back, the ones who were held back will be held back, and the ones who don't have anything held back will float further towards white nationalism.
There's also kind of conflict in the Proud Boys between anti-Semitism, right, and the non-anti-Semitic part of that. That seems to be one of the main dynamics there. Sorry, Alex, you had a different question.
No, I was just gonna think. I think we were only beginning to see the impact of the Capitol Hill riot on the splintering as well. Like a lot of the FBI has been traditionally not particularly interested in the far right, but with a new administration coming in and this very obvious violation of the norms of American life, and the people's house has been violated, all that kind of stuff. I feel like we've already seen some Proud Boy leaders be arrested by the feds, and I expect more charges to be brought in, however long it is. And, when those kind of leadership people get put in prison, then oftentimes we see fragmentation as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of their leaders are going to be arrested. I mean, the FBI hasn't been interested in the Proud Boys. They did finally, after the El Paso massacre in 2018, start to crack down, but they were looking at Adam Waffen in the base, and they have basically destroyed those networks. I mean, when the FBI wants to come after you, it takes a minute for them to rev up, but game's over. They'll make up charges, or they just have endless resources. You can't beat them. I mean, we've seen this in the radical left over and over again. So yeah, now that they're focused on what the Capitol takeover was interesting, because they're largely more moderate Trumpists who generally didn't have those aggressive tactics, sprinkled in with members of militias, Oath Keepers. A number of them just got arrested, Proud Boys and others, and they're all especially if they're known activists in these organizations, they're all going to go down, and this is going to be a big blow to them for sure. And the FBI is happy to bend any rule of decency and help pursue in hand with the prosecutors, help pursue the largest charges that they can, and this cannot help them as an organization.
Yeah, whenever you talk about the FBI, you've got to refer people to the latest Chris Morris film, where basically fit up a bunch of vulnerable Muslim young men and get them done on terrorism charges for basically saying that they maybe would be interested in blowing up something someday. But
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not crying me a river over these guys being arrested, but there's no way the feds are going to treat them fairly. That's just not how they act.
Do you think that there might be kind of room for a hybridization of various other kinds of kind of moderate Trumpists? I mean, moderate, but also conspiratorial in this kind of deranged way. I mean, I think derangement is a totally reasonable way of describing QAnon and so on. As QAnon deflates, but also hardens in various other ways. How do you see this kind of hybridizing with the more organizational far right, or do you think it's a totally separate tendency and they'll never really see eye to eye?
Well, I mean, so there was a really big. This is something we were yelling about in 2014, 2015. Is that there had become these very big new far-right platforms to the right of Fox News. Breitbart became the most famous of them. That had millions of followers, and people outside of the right-wing watchers weren't paying any attention to this, and we're like, this is new how big these things are. This is a new space between white nationalism, between the full fash and the regular GOP that's opened and is, I mean, it's always been there, but it's really expanded massively. So the QAnon people, I think, are going to that space isn't, even if the Trumpist thing deflates, it's going to go back to that level of 2014, 2015, which was quite significant. It's not going to decrease below that because it just had a whole influx of new people entering the far right. And even when they leave, it doesn't mean even they leave as a street activist, doesn't mean their views change. And so I think people are going to, so there's this sort of midway. I mean, right-wing populist is probably the equivalent in Europe, very conspiratorial driven social media and other platforms, media platforms that people are going to go back into. They're flooded with, they're based on conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are sort of like the way the left uses Marxism or some other kind of analytical theory. They use conspiracy theories as their analysis.
Oh,
and I think the QAnon people will move back into that thing. I mean, they generally don't do grassroots organizing. They have had the opportunity to do street demonstrations, and so they have, but I think those are going to largely go away because the QAnon people as such aren't going to be like the Proud Boys and be based on wanting to get drunk and get in fights. A few of them, sure, but and so I think they're going to go back into that. Things are going to recede to that level, and that's going to be their sort of resting place. And then it's going to depend on if there becomes I would say if there becomes a new party or new movement, but the US political system, the two-party system just locks out, I mean, even more so in Britain where it tends to also be two-party, but there's enough wiggle room to have these third and fourth parties, and we just don't have that here. And so, unless there can be some way that these right-wing populist movements can congeal politically, it could be a big organization. I'm sure people are going to try to start a third party and it's going to fail because they always do. It might have legs for a moment, for a year or two, but then it will fail. It's hard to see what form that they can take that's going to have some sort of steady, that's going to be a steady enough thing for a while. So I think. Do
you not think that Trump might form that kind of thing deliberately through becoming a kind of? I mean, this is an absurd comparison, maybe, but through almost becoming a kind of Alex Jones too, right? Who's not kind of conspiratorial in the kind of the way that Alex Jones is, but nevertheless has that alternative reality culture that he just can, he just produces this kind of alternate reality. People, millions of people perhaps believe that he is really legitimately the president, and they just live in this other world. They don't necessarily have any kind of organized political form, but they exist fundamentally in a different reality.
Well, sure. I mean, I think, I don't know what he's going to do. There's all this talk about Trump TV or whatever, but that's not going to, yes, and they'll follow that media platform or whatever it is, but they won't take a political form. I mean, that's the question. Yes, the millions of people, 75 million or something, 75 million people voted for Trump. Those people aren't going to, they're not all Trumpists, but they're not all going to go away. So millions and millions and millions of people drank the Kool-Aid, but will they remain politically active versus passively consuming far-right media? That depends. Will they continue to passively consume far-right media and social media? Yes, yes. But will they be able to turn that into a political form? That's another question.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's an accurate assessment. Alex, do you have any final questions? I want to ask one more about this upcoming work you're doing on some really insane people. You think QAnon, they're kind of, they're kind of off the deep end, but let me tell you, there's another pool and it's even deeper. And it is.
Okay, I do have a question. Is that
James Mason, but this is going so well. My intro to the question. Okay, you go for it, Alex, and then I'll do that whole thing again.
You can edit it.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
All right, so the kind of big Trump news, apart from him leaving the presidency, is obviously him banned from his most favorite of all websites, Twitter. And that has been come along with a huge banning of a bunch of QAnon accounts and a bunch of other kind of Trump-associated accounts as well. And I wondered because there's some stuff in the guide about deplatforming people from far-right activists from social media. And I wondered what your take was on this debate I've had with people and other anti-fascists have had about investing the power of silencing, not in a kind of 1984, censoring kind of way, but literally just taking people out of the conversation. How comfortable are you with that being invested in Jack from Twitter or Mark Zuckerberg, or do you know what I mean? These giant media companies.
On one hand, I think Twitter should have banned Trump in 2015. I'm really, this kicking these far-right things off the platform have increased year after year after year. There's increased more and more and more, and it shows they could have done it initially. They've always had the right to do it. They've always had terms of service. This is one of the things is all these platforms have always had terms of service, and these people have always violated them. If they would have just enforced the existing terms of service from the beginning, we wouldn't even have this discussion about whether it was right or not to ban people. So on one hand, I'm for aggressively kicking these people off. Could there be blowback on us? Sure. And there's been individual instances of groups it's going down, got kicked off Facebook. But let's just be honest. Tens of thousands of their accounts get kicked off, and a sprinkling of a dozen or two of ours do. And maybe it's just because I don't run one of those accounts, but I think they're just throwing them under the bus to make it look equal. And it's a good trade for us on that level. Now, I don't want to, that said, that's just from a strict, almost anti-fascist perspective, just what do we do we'll do anything we can to cut their throats, right? To pull the rug out from under them. I'm not advocating you actually slice the throats of Trumpists.
Yeah, the position of Trevor Swat is against cutting throats, just for the clear, Mr. SoundCloud moderator.
So I mean, there is a question when these various sort of platforms gain what's an essential monopoly. In the past it was really Facebook. Now Twitter is coming into this position, and then what it means to allow a company, which is a private company, which has its full rights to do this, to decide who gets to be on it or not. That's a legitimate question. I think we're all working this out. On one hand, these things move quite quickly. People call for like nationalization of whatever, of Facebook or something, and then 2 years later, Facebook isn't so important. So these things move in importance that go up and down so quick. I'm a little dubious about these claims of like, we must do this because it's a monopoly. I mean, there's always alternatives to these things. Just as the fash or where the far right are switching platforms very quickly, so can we. Like, people will continue to organize. Especially the internet, gives and takes. Whatever you take from it, it will pop up something new somewhere else, or innovate. So I don't think this is like even such a de facto censoring. I don't think that we should allow people whose whole point is to spin just pure lies and demonizing groups that are oppressed. We shouldn't allow them a platform. The whole idea of free speech is that even the liberal idea is that people with different views come into a conversation and they get to a decision. Just lying about stuff has no place in that. And I'm not saying someone who once in a while lies or once in a while says something you don't agree with, but people like Alex Jones, whose entire shtick is just to lie, 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 lie. They don't need to be part of any conversation. That doesn't add to the liberal conception of free speech at all. If people just use their platform to call for violence and genocide, that voice has no place in our society, and we just shouldn't allow it. I mean, that's my position on this stuff. I mean, we already don't allow certain voices. We don't allow people calling for murder. We don't allow people advocating, having sex with children or whatever, and like, so there already is an outside. And I think that outside as a society needs to be pulled in. And maybe that's a US thing. In Germany, this is already, largely the case. There's many countries. It's not like it is here where this is pulled in, where you can't do certain things. But the rest of it, I mean, maybe this is a cop-out answer, but we're going to have to work that out. I mean, we are trying to work out what this give and take is, where that line is. When you have these near monopolies, what are the obligations of these platforms? What social media really means? Like, it isn't the same thing as old media platforms were. Like in the US, it was always, you could always publish a newspaper or whatever. You could always start your own TV stations. Is social media really the same thing as that? Because it's not exactly, but it has many of the same places. So, I mean, like I said, maybe it's a cop-out, but this is something that's going to have to be, is going to have to continue to be worked out, what that tension is and where the place that it lands is, how it finds equilibrium. And it's going to take a while. And it may be that the changes in technology shift the whole thing again, and the question becomes irrelevant very quickly.
I'm kind of similarly, not conflicted, but like in between, in a similar place as you. I feel like ultimately the power should be invested in us and our movements that we build to defeat the far right or to diminish the far right in its capacity. And so, Twitter is having voices taken off Twitter is all well and good, but ultimately it's up to us as, people opposing the far right. There's also another interesting thing which kind of just struck me of like how when the far right move on to niche and niche platforms, their politics gets more and more extreme or gets niche and niche as it kind of filters out the mass into like a more pure form. And that's something that maybe people don't consider, but I'm in a similar place to you. Sam?
I wanted to ask about the what I'm now going to describe, because I was interrupted before, as the hadiopelagic depths. I looked that up. It's the very bottom of the sea. So you get the whatever it's called, the littoral pelagic, right, where like there's the light passes through, and then you get the kind of the rest of them, and the mesopelagic, and then the abyssopelagic. Abyssopelagic is the bottom of the normal sea, but then you've got these like big trenches, like abyssopelagic in terms of thinking. That's QAnon, right? Like that's really the very, very sunken depths of strangeness. But then there are these cracks in the sea which go down even deeper. And what I'm going to that is where James Mason and SEIGE resides, in this kind of hadiopelagic little crack, tiny thing, nowhere near as important as QAnon or the grand scale of things, but so much more mad. So you mentioned Atomwaffen and the base. I don't think the base were explicitly influenced by SEIGE, but Atomwaffen division very, very, very much were. And they were, as you said, kind of pulled apart by the FBI. They've now regurgitated themselves from the Hadiopelagic depths as the National Socialist Order, and so on. And the base, although it was also pulled apart by the FBI, has now returned in the form of a nebulous, unnamed project by Ronaldo Nazzaro, who was the founder of the base, and it's kind of Jupiterian leader from his position in St. Petersburg. So you're writing about James Mason and SEIGE. What are you writing about it, and what's your kind of overall like sense of how this book functions in the really extreme end of the far right now?
Well, first I want to say, as somebody with a PhD, I always like when people use words that I don't know and have never even read before. So, and it was a better introduction than the other one. So, see, it was good that you got interrupted. There's a lot of. So the James Mason book has been very interesting for me. There's two parts of it. One is how the splintering of the American Nazi Party, which by that time was called the NSWPP, the National Socialist White People's Party, but we'll just call it the American Nazi Party. How the splintering of it in the 1970s produced both the neo-Nazi movement as we know it in the United States, really created as a national spread around movement with different tendencies, but also explored the different tactical positions that would be adopted and are still used today by neo-Nazis, Mason being in the most radical faction. But one of the things that really stood out, and this has to do with the movement, I'm going to actually tie this into the movement to more and more niche platforms, is that when Rockwell created the party officially in 1959, there was a precursor in 58. Nazism was a taboo word, in the United States in the post-war era. To be a Nazi was almost unthinkable. It was like a cartoonish thing, and he picked that term very intentionally. He was like in advertising, and he's a graphic designer, and some of the early stuff is very well designed to draw attention to him. He was like, oh, well, this is the worst thing in the world. This is the most evil thing. Well, we're going to become that thing, and I'm going to use that for media attention. He even said something like, no one can ignore Nazis marching in the streets. He's like, I'm going to take all that reaction to it. I'm going to use this as PR, any good publicity. Any publicity is good publicity. And I'm going to use this as a recruiting tool. So in one sense, this was good that in the post-war era, because the fascist governments were very openly accepted in the 1930s. There was wide sympathy for them in the United States and Britain and elsewhere. It was good that after the war, they became a taboo thing, that fascism became taboo. Everyone agreed, we're going to ground out. This is no longer going to be a legitimate political philosophy that is in competition with others. It's attack the communists, it's attack the capitalists. None of us have any use for it. We're going to grind it into the ground. But in doing so, they did it so effectively that they made it, this, hyper negative thing. And then people could take the hyper negative thing and then use that as an organizing tool themselves. I don't like to cite philosophers, but if you've read Foucault and his notion of power, it's exactly like that's supposed to work. Power acts on something and turns it into this thing, and then people take the thing it's turned it into and then put it in a positive direction, right? And so that's what they did. So yes, it's good to back to the moving off Twitter or whatever to Parler and Telegram and stuff. Yes, it's good to deplatform people, but it drives them into more niche things, and then the niche things they can then get hardened and expand back out. The moral of this story is fascists in the far right are speaking to some need and concern in society, and unless you get that need and concern taken care of in some way, you're not going to be able to get rid of these movements. You can marginalize these movements. You can keep them, boxed in, but they're there because they're appealing to something that people feel. And unless you can get rid of that feeling, the movements aren't going to go away. This is like the left says ideas are bulletproof. People have tried, these juntas in Latin America tried to kill all the communists by, murdering them, and it didn't work. It's the same thing. We can marginalize some of these movements, but we can't make them go away. They're there for a reason. They're filling some cultural, social, and political need. So yeah, that's how the story of James Mason and the or I guess if George Lincoln Rockwell and Parler and Telegram fit together.
And beyond that, the Matrix and Wire and right, all these kind of like super underground.
All the little, as they hop from niche thing to niche thing. But yeah, I mean, it is a problem that we're going to see. Once people turn into a mass movement, they tend to moderate their politics a little bit. I've seen that in the radical left. It's definitely happened with the anti-globalization movement and stuff. Anarchists who are driving it got into this, and then you water it down because you're trying to appeal to more and more people. And once you retreat, things tend to get more driven by the ideological hardcore. The same thing is going to happen to them. But what do you do? Yeah. I mean, it's a question of what do you do? I mean,
I think it's a really interesting account you gave, right? Because in part, it brings us back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the podcast, which was, and you always articulated it in terms of a kind of a flip. So although people, I think, generally tend to assume that the smaller the group are, the more specialist attention it requires, right? Like, so kind of minuscule, really extreme neo-Nazi stuff like the Base and Atomwaffen, maybe not so much the Base, but Atomwaffen, definitely, seem like this just kind of minuscule, like, gang, right? And like, how was a movement, like a mass movement, going to like affect or engage with this gang at all? And ultimately, I don't think they really did. And it took the FBI to really kind of take that group apart. Perhaps anti-fascists were involved in various like parts of that, not as the FBI, but kind of they contributed to it. But I still it seemed and does seem to me still that the anti-fascists in the movement of the left and so on don't have ways of engaging with these kind of almost like maniacal or kind of fanatical fascists, and that's a big problem. But the way you told the story there of like how to engage with these people actually flips it around, right? So it says, and it's not just this kind of like tiny hardened niche of like kind of 25 really dangerous people, but it does speak to a much more broad general need. And I think that's actually quite a hopeful thing for thinking about in terms of mass movement anti-fascism. So even though the symptoms express themselves as these tiny hardened cliques of as I say, kind of fanatical neo-Nazis, there's still a way of addressing the conditions under which those kind of cliques or those kind of like hardened niches are formed, which is through a much broader, much more polyphonous, much more highly socially open anti-fascist movement as well.
I think we need to, one of the things that I think we have to come to maybe terms with or recognize is that we may never get rid of groups like neo-Nazis by whatever name. There's always going to be people who are disenchanted with the society and who are going to express that disenchantment in a radical conservatism. Whether it's Nazi, whether it's I always think of this guy, the Bloody Baron von Ungern, who was a white general who went to Mongolia during the Civil War and became an alliance with the Mongolian Buddhists to create this sort of messianic far right, but not Nazi, right, but far right, anti-communist, anti-Chinese movement. So you can have a kind of radical, reactionary, revolutionary conservatism that is not necessarily neo-Nazi, and there may always be people like that at least as long as we have Western political conceptions, right? Like, I mean, that might be something that we're stuck with, and it's just something that we have to sort of constantly look over and ensure that its ideas don't start to ripple out in the larger society.
This has been a really good interview. Spencer, you've been a really good guest. Where can people find you if they want to see more of your work? What's the best place to find you?
I have a webpage at spencersunshine.com. The 40 Ways guide is available there for free as text and as printable PDFs. Please print them out. I'm active mostly on Twitter, Transform67889. Got a meme page on Instagram for fun. I got a Facebook if you still do the Book of Face. And I have a Patreon if you'd like to support my work. I do it totally independently. Organizations don't like me. Academics keep me at an arm's length. So if you've liked what you've heard and you like the things I'm doing, please support me on Patreon. And that concludes our moment of capitalism.
It's always necessary. Thank you so much for coming, Spencer. Thank you. And hopefully we'll we'll kind of meet in person at some point, in the kind of the coming years when COVID is over and when fascism has been conclusively destroyed, despite your kind of pessimism about that possibility.
It's been great being on the show, and I did a couple talks in London the days after Trump was elected, and I do hope whenever COVID permits that I will be back.
Definitely.
Great. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, that was really fun.
Yeah, that was super good, actually.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
Thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed that, then you can help support the podcast on Patreon. All the support we get means a lot to us, and it really does help us grow this project. So that's patreon.com/12rulesforwhat, and you can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Thanks a lot, and I will see you very soon.
12 rules.